What if I told you that the greatest empire of its time fell at the hands of a tiny band of adventurers? These men came from across the ocean and challenged a state with a population of millions.
Their campaign was a series of incredible risks, alliances, and fatal mistakes.
Each decision made by the commander changed the course of history and increased the level of threat. Watch the video to the end to find out how an impregnable city on the water was reduced to ashes.
The landing of strangers on an unknown shore was the starting point of a large-scale conflict.
The expedition commander understood that there was no turning back. He made the radical decision to destroy their own means of transportation by water. This step deprived his squad of any possibility of retreat. Now they had only one way forward, into the depths of unknown lands.
Santiago!
Are you ready for the shocking truth about the beginning of this journey? The local landscape was a severe test for the new arrivals. Dense forests gave way to steep mountain passes and deep gorges. The strangers were forced to make their way through completely unfamiliar terrain. Each new day brought them information about the powerful empire that ruled these lands. Rumors of the capital's wealth fueled the commander's ambitions. He realized that control of this center would give him incredible power. The detachment began a slow advance into the continent. They moved cautiously, forming a marching order and preparing for any surprises. Local tribes watched the advance of the unknown warriors with concern. The strangers used steel weapons, which were strikingly different from the equipment commonly used here.
Their armor reflected the sunlight, creating a powerful psychological effect.
The expedition commander proved to be a skilled diplomat and strategist. He quickly realized that the vast empire was held together by the fear of its subordinate peoples. Many provinces paid heavy tribute and secretly hated the central government. This division in society became the main trump card in the hands of the conquerors. They began to offer local leaders an alliance against a common enemy. The first clashes with independent tribes demonstrated the superiority of the new tactics. The strangers acted in unison, using close formation and firearms. The roar of gunfire caused panic in the ranks of the defenders of local settlements.
However, after demonstrating his strength, the commander always offered peace talks.
Gradually, the army of strangers began to be replenished with thousands of local warriors. These people knew the terrain and the ruling empire's methods of warfare very well. They became guides, porters, and the main striking force of the expedition. The balance of power on the continent began to change rapidly. A handful of adventurers became the core of a huge rebel army. At this point, the tension reached its first peak. The strangers understood that entering this city could be a trap for them, but there was nowhere to retreat, and they began their descent into the valley. We are very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about the commander's decision to cut off the retreat? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel. The hidden truth that everyone is silent about is the vulnerability of this huge capital. The city on the water depended on food and fresh water supplies from the mainland. 3 wide dams connected the island to the shores of a huge lake. Along these artificial roads, the army of strangers slowly approached the main gate. Thousands of locals climbed onto the roofs of their houses to see the unseen guests. The ruler of the empire decided to meet the commander of the strangers in person. Their meeting took place on one of the main dams at the entrance to the city. It was a clash of 2 completely different worlds and worldviews. The ruler showed diplomatic courtesy and invited the guests to his capital. He allocated one of the huge empty palaces for them to live in. Once inside, the conquerors were able to appreciate the true scale of the metropolis. Straight streets intersected with a network of wide navigable canals. In the center stood a huge temple complex in the form of step pyramids.
Tens of thousands of merchants from all over the country gathered daily at the huge market.
The organization of city life was striking in its thoughtfulness and strict order. However, admiration quickly gave way to a growing sense of anxiety and danger. The detachment was on an island, surrounded by a potential enemy army numbering in the thousands. Any of the dams could be destroyed within a few hours. In that case, the strangers would be completely cut off from the outside world. The commander understood that they had voluntarily walked into a perfect trap. To protect themselves, the conquerors began to fortify the palace assigned to them. They installed artillery pieces opposite the main entrances to the building. The soldiers organized round-the-clock guard duty and forbade local residents from approaching the walls. The tension between the guests and the hosts of the city grew with each passing day. Both sides understood that open conflict was only a matter of time. At this time, the commander of the strangers conducted secret inspections of the city's fortifications.
He studied the water supply system and the location of the main food warehouses.
His mind was already devising plans for a full-scale siege. Allied local tribes outside the city were preparing for a possible attack. The situation in the capital resembled a powder keg ready to explode at any moment. The commander realized that he needed to take a radical and unexpected step. A conventional defense of the palace would lead to a slow depletion of supplies. It was necessary to strike at the very heart of the empire's political system. He gathered his most trusted officers for a secret meeting. The plan they devised was incredibly bold and risky. They decided to capture the emperor right in his own palace. This move would completely paralyze the will of a multi-million-strong state. Do you think capturing the ruler was the only way to avoid defeat? Such decisions always change the course of history in the most unpredictable ways. In the next chapter, you will learn how this daring plan was put into action. Something you have never seen before happened within the walls of this palace. A small group of heavily armed officers arrived for an audience with the ruler of the empire. They acted quickly, decisively, and without the slightest hesitation. The commander of the strangers accused the ruler of attacking the coastal garrison. He demanded that the ruler immediately move to the conqueror's residence as a hostage. The ruler was faced with an impossible choice in a critical situation. Refusal meant an immediate blow from steel blades right in the throne room. Agreement meant public humiliation and the actual loss of real power. After much hesitation, he complied with the demands and left his palace. This moment became a point of no return for the entire state system. Suddenly, the commander of the strangers received extremely unpleasant news. A new army sent by his political rivals had landed on the coast.
Their goal was to arrest the commander himself and seize control of the conquered lands.
He had to divide his forces at the most inopportune moment. He took some of his soldiers and hurried to the coast to resolve the problem. A small garrison remained in the capital under the command of his deputy. This man did not possess the diplomatic talents of his superior. He saw a threat in every movement of the local residents and was terrified of a riot. Tension in the city, deprived of the commander's firm hand, reached its limit. Any careless action could provoke a full-scale uprising. Soon, a major traditional holiday began in the capital. Thousands of noble warriors gathered in the main square for ceremonies. The deputy commander decided that this was preparation for an armed attack on the palace. He made the fateful decision to launch a preemptive strike against the gathering. Armed strangers blocked the exits from the square and launched a swift attack. This action destroyed the last remnants of the fragile political balance.
The city, which had long endured the presence of the invaders, instantly rose up in revolt.
Huge crowds of armed townspeople surrounded the strangers' residence. The conquerors found themselves completely isolated, locked behind the thick walls of the palace. Their artillery barely held back the relentless onslaught of the angry crowd. Upon learning of what had happened, the commander hurried back to the burning capital. He managed to break through to the palace, but the situation was already out of control. The empire had risen up, and a handful of strangers found themselves in the center of a raging hurricane. If you are impressed by the scale and beauty of this lost city, be sure to like this video. Your support helps us create new historical reconstructions. The hidden code that changed everything was the vulnerability of the stone walls. The returning commander found his troops in a disastrous situation. The rebellious city had completely blocked all supplies of food and fresh water. The palace had become an island fortress under constant attack day and night. Stones and arrows rained down on the roofs and courtyards of the building. The defenders attempted to use firearms to repel the attacks. Artillery volleys cut wide swaths through the dense ranks of attackers. But for every warrior who fell, dozens of new ones immediately took their place. The numerical superiority of the townspeople made any defense only a matter of time. Supplies of gunpowder and lead were melting away at an alarming rate. The commander ordered the construction of mobile wooden towers for counterattacks. These structures were intended to protect the archers when they ventured out into the streets of the city. However, the townspeople quickly found a way to counter this tactic. They destroyed the bridges over the canals and threw heavy stones at the towers from the rooftops. The strangers had to retreat back behind the safe walls of the palace. In desperation, the commander decided to play his last card. He brought the captured ruler to the roof of the palace to stop the uprising. The ruler appealed to his people to lay down their arms and disperse, but the crowd no longer recognized the authority of their broken leader. In response to his words, a hail of stones flew toward the roof. The ruler was severely injured and collapsed onto the stone floor. He was carried inside the building, where his life came to an end. The ruler's departure meant the final severance of all possible diplomatic ties. Now the uprising took on the character of a merciless war of total destruction. The strangers no longer had any hostages or room for maneuver. The night of the breakthrough was dark, with heavy rain pouring down. The detachment left the palace and moved silently toward the nearest dam. They walked the first few hundred meters unnoticed through the deserted streets. It seemed that the daring evacuation plan had every chance of success. But soon the silence was broken by a loud alarm. The city woke up, and thousands of soldiers rushed to intercept the retreating troops. The darkness of night was instantly filled with the noise and chaos of fierce battle. Do you think it was possible to organize a safer retreat? In such conditions, every decision inevitably leads to unpredictable consequences. In the next chapter, you will learn about the most catastrophic night in the history of this campaign. The retreat along the narrow causeway quickly turned into uncontrollable chaos. The lake around the road was instantly filled with hundreds of light boats carrying local warriors. They attacked the retreating strangers from both flanks with long spears. The wooden portable bridge carried at the front of the column got stuck in the first hole. The column came to a halt, becoming an ideal target for a night attack. The rear ranks continued to push forward, unaware that the path ahead was blocked by water. People began to fall off the edges of the slippery dam straight into the cold lake. Heavy steel armor and bags of gold pulled the soldiers to the bottom. Panic gripped the unit, completely destroying military discipline and order. Everyone tried to save themselves, abandoning their weapons and comrades. The gaps in the dam quickly filled with carts, cannons, and drowning people. The next rows of retreating soldiers were forced to walk right through this terrible traffic jam. The commander, who was at the forefront, managed to break through to the safety of the shore. However, most of his army remained trapped on a narrow strip of land. Rain and darkness made it difficult to coordinate actions and help those who were lagging behind. The allied tribes accompanying the strangers also suffered enormous losses. Their formation was broken, and they found themselves trapped between the water and the attackers. The desperate resistance of the rear guard allowed some of the men to cross the gaps. But by morning, the scale of the disaster was clear to all the survivors. The detachment had lost most of its personnel and almost all of its artillery. Almost all of the gold that had been captured earlier remained at the bottom of the dark lake. Weapons were lost and gunpowder was completely soaked by heavy rain. This defeat went down in history as the most tragic and difficult night of the campaign. The survivors were a pitiful sight, exhausted, hopeless people. The commander understood that his ambitious plan had ended in complete failure. Once on the mainland, the remnants of the army could not feel safe. The rebellious city sent large pursuit detachments after them. The strangers had to begin an exhausting march towards the lands of their allies. They moved without sleep or rest, constantly fending off small attacks. Hunger and extreme exhaustion became their main enemies on this journey. After several days, the pursuit reached its climax on a wide plain. The vast army of the empire blocked the path of the tiny detachment of surviving strangers. The balance of power was absolutely catastrophic for the retreating forces. The commander decided to give one last decisive battle, despite their fatigue. He lined his men up in tight formation, preparing to repel the attack. The commander faced the difficult task of restoring his army's combat capability. Many officers demanded an immediate return to the coast and a complete abandonment of the campaign. But the leader's ambition did not allow him to accept such a crushing defeat. He began to develop a new, even more ambitious plan to capture the capital. This pause became a period of regrouping before the final act of the tragedy. A secret that has only now been revealed explains the true reason for the fall of the capital. While the strangers were regaining their strength, an unforeseen disaster struck the city on the water. A mass weakness began to spread rapidly among the local population. The city's inhabitants had absolutely no immunity to this new scourge. The decline in strength swept through entire neighborhoods, robbing people of their ability to resist. This invisible threat took out more defenders than steel weapons. The capital's defense system started to fall apart due to a lack of healthy soldiers. The new ruler of the empire also fell victim to this rapid illness. The administration of the state passed to his successor in a state of deep crisis. The city was losing its strength from within, without even seeing an enemy before it. The siege began with the destruction of the main aqueduct that supplied the island with fresh water. The inhabitants of the capital were forced to use brackish water from the lake. This decision led to a sharp deterioration of the situation inside the blockaded city. Food supplies quickly ran out, and severe famine began among the population. The pride of the empire turned into a huge prison for its own inhabitants. The attacking army divided into 3 large groups for a simultaneous assault. Each column began a slow advance along one of the main dams. Ships provided fire support from the flanks, destroying defensive barricades. The city's defenders resisted with the desperation of doomed men. They rebuilt the destroyed fortifications every night, preparing for new attacks. The fighting on the dams was incredibly intense and stubborn on both sides. Every meter of road cost the attackers enormous effort. The defenders used long spears and stones to hold back the onslaught of the Allied armies. The strangers were forced to methodically fill the canals with debris from buildings. They turned the city on the water into a continuous stretch of solid land. This scorched earth tactic slowly but surely narrowed the encirclement. The beautiful neighborhoods of the capital were turned into piles of rubble and ashes. The grandeur of the architecture was destroyed for the tactical advantage of the attackers. The commander understood that nothing would remain of the former magnificent city, but that was the price he was willing to pay for complete victory. Day after day, the defenders' zone of control was inexorably shrinking. The besieged retreated to the northern parts of the island, maintaining order. Was the complete destruction of the city justified for the sake of its capture? War often dictates its own harsh laws, blurring the lines of what is acceptable. In the next chapter, you will learn how the final battles for each neighborhood unfolded. The tactic of destroying buildings became the main method of urban warfare. The aliens and their allies methodically demolished houses, palaces, and temples. Stone and brick were thrown into the canals, creating wide roads. Heavy artillery and advancing forces could move freely along these passages. The city, once hovering above the water, was irretrievably sinking into ruins. The defenders continued to use guerrilla tactics in their native metropolis. They hid in the surviving buildings and launched surprise attacks from behind. The attackers had to carefully clear every meter of captured territory. The nights brought only brief respites in this endless battle. The constant tension exhausted the forces of both the besiegers and the besieged. The central square with the main pyramids became the arena for the most fierce clashes. The conquerors sought to capture the temple complex to demonstrate their superiority. The fighting took place on steep steps, where it was impossible to use formations. The defenders defended their shrines with unprecedented tenacity. Ultimately, the invaders managed to establish control over the heights. The fall of the main temple dealt a crushing blow to the morale of the townspeople. The symbol of their faith and power was now in the hands of their implacable enemy. However, the resistance did not cease, but moved to the residential quarters. The last ruler of the empire called on his people to stand firm until the very end. He rejected all offers of surrender conveyed through ambassadors. Ships on the lake continued to thwart any attempts to break the blockade. The city's inhabitants fed on roots, tree bark, and algae. The unbearable conditions broke many, but the soldiers remained at their posts. They built new barricades from the rubble of their own homes, The capital turned into a huge labyrinth of rubble, ashes, and despair. The allied local tribes were particularly cruel to the defeated. A century of oppression by the capital resulted in large-scale and ruthless revenge. The commander of the strangers could not control the actions of his army of thousands of allies. The destruction became systematic, erasing all traces of the once great civilization. The city ceased to exist as a physical and cultural space. The siege lasted almost 3 months, turning into an exhausting marathon. The attackers also suffered from a lack of supplies and constant tension. Rain turned the dust and ashes into impassable mud in the streets. Progress was measured not by streets, but by destroyed houses. Each side understood that the denouement of this drama was inexorably approaching. The ruler of the empire, along with the remnants of the nobility, took refuge in the northern region. It was the last pocket of organized resistance on the vast island. The territory under defense was reduced to a few hundred square meters. The invaders brought in all their available forces for a final, decisive assault. The ring closed, leaving the defenders without the slightest chance of escape. The breakthrough plan failed from the very beginning. The invaders' patrol ships quickly spotted movement on the water. They intercepted the ruler's boat and forced it to dock. The capture of the last leader marked the symbolic end of the Great Siege. The city, reduced to ruins, finally ceased its resistance. The captured ruler appeared before the alien commander with his head held high. He declared that he had done everything possible to defend his homeland. The ruler asked to be stripped of his status and to accept his fate, as his mission was over. But the commander responded cautiously and retained his status as an honored prisoner. He planned to use his influence to pacify the remaining provinces. After the ruler surrendered, a deafening silence fell over the ruins of the city. The huge metropolis, once full of life, had turned into a lifeless wasteland. The surviving residents slowly began to leave the destroyed neighborhoods. The victors allowed them to go to the mainland in search of a new refuge. A procession of exhausted people stretched along the surviving dams for several days. Soldiers began searching the ruins for the gold that had been lost earlier. However, they were deeply disappointed, as there was almost no treasure left. Most of the riches had either been safely hidden or lost forever. Discontent among the rank and file began to grow rapidly. They had endured a long siege but had not received the promised reward. The commander quickly shifted his people's attention to new goals. He announced plans to capture neighboring territories that had not yet been conquered. The conqueror's ambitions were not limited to one city, however huge it might be. The collapsed empire left behind a huge vacuum of political power. The outsiders began to methodically fill this vacuum with their garrisons. The allied tribes that had helped destroy the capital soon realized their mistake. Having gotten rid of one ruler, they ended up with much harsher masters. The new authorities had no intention of sharing control over resources with them. The former allies quickly became ordinary subjects of the new vast empire. It was too late to resist, as the military machine of the strangers had gained strength. Construction of a new city began on the site of the destroyed capital. The commander ordered the buildings to be constructed according to strict European standards. The stones of ancient temples served as the foundation for new government palaces. The canals were gradually filled in, turning into ordinary paved streets. The geography and architecture of the region began to change irreversibly. The ruins of the old capital were forever buried under the foundations of the new world. The history of the empire became a legend recorded by the victors. Only a few chronicles preserve the memory of the former greatness of the vanished state. This conflict showed how quickly even the most stable system can collapse. The scale of the consequences of this campaign still amazes researchers. The capture of the capital triggered a domino effect across the vast continent. Upon learning of the fall of the central government, the distant provinces plunged into a deep crisis. The conquerors sent small detachments to establish control over the regions. In most cases, the garrisons surrendered without serious resistance. The reputation of the victors preceded their organized military columns. The new administration embarked on a radical restructuring of the economic system. A system of large estates was introduced, which were transferred to loyal officers. Local residents were required to work on these lands in exchange for basic protection. This system completely destroyed the traditional way of life for millions of people. The continent's resources began to flow out of the region in a powerful stream. Despite strict control, elements of the old culture secretly survived. Local craftsmen wove traditional motifs into new architectural forms. Ancient tales and legends were passed down from generation to generation orally. A complex fusion of two completely different worldviews took place. This process of forming a new identity took many decades of hard work. The military tactics of the foreigners also underwent some important changes. They adopted light cotton armor from local warriors for protection. In the hot climate, it proved to be much more effective than heavy equipment. The conquerors learned to navigate the harsh conditions of the tropical forests. Adaptation became the key to maintaining control over vast and complex territories. The fate of the Allied leaders who supported the commander turned out to be pretty sad. Soon they were stripped of all their privileges and real power. The new administration didn't need strong and independent local authorities. Their descendants completely dissolved into the new social strata of society. The pragmatism of the victors left no room for gratitude for past decisions. The echoes of this large-scale conflict spread to all the courts of other continents. Neighboring states watched with surprise as new resources flowed in. This provoked a new wave of expeditions and territorial conquests. The whole world entered an era of fierce struggle for control of trade routes. The model of behavior developed in the valley became the standard for many. The history of this campaign became a classic example of complex military strategy. The commander's tactics were studied in detail by many thinkers in subsequent eras. His ability to use diplomacy and force became a striking example of adaptation. The mistakes of the defending empire also became an important lesson for historians. This event forever changed the vector of development of the entire structure of the region. Decades after the fall of the city, the region was completely and permanently transformed. A huge, thriving colonial center grew up on the site of the destroyed neighborhoods. It became a key hub in the global trade network of the new era. Ships regularly sailed between continents, transporting goods and people. The geographical isolation of this continent was permanently and irrevocably overcome. The new society was a complex and strict hierarchical structure. At the top were representatives of the administration who had arrived from across the ocean. Below them were the descendants of the first conquerors and numerous settlers. The bulk of the population consisted of local residents who had been deprived of their former influence. This social ladder determined the entire life of the huge and growing colony. The region's integration into the global economy had very mixed consequences. On the one hand, new farming cultures and effective technologies emerged. On the other hand, the exploitation of resources reached unprecedented levels. The economy worked exclusively to enrich the distant metropolis. The development of local industry was artificially restrained by the new authorities. The fall of the great capital remained the most vivid symbol of this complex era. It demonstrated the vulnerability of any system, even the most powerful one. Neither high barriers nor huge armies can guarantee eternal stability. The key factor was the system's unpreparedness for confrontation with the unknown. Adaptability defeated the traditional, unwieldy management structure. Today, new buildings stand alongside the remains of ancient stone foundations. They serve as a silent reminder of the tragic and great events of the past. The history of this conflict continues to spark debate among researchers. The past cannot be changed, but it must be studied carefully and in detail. The lessons of this campaign are important for understanding the development of global historical processes. The story of the fall of a great empire on the water is not just a chronicle of a clash. It is a large-scale lesson in political strategy and adaptation. We saw how ambition and a chain of unpredictable decisions led to the collapse of a huge state. What do you think of this format for historical analysis? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see next time in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos.